Thank you. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. This presentation is the first time that I'm presenting work on a concept that I've been developing about building an intersectional metaverse, but that is a conversation for the future. Today, I'm going to specifically be talking about a small part of that, specifically where we as an open source community for Open 3D Engine can start to address and become leaders in area of inclusion for 3D development, which aren't always at the forefront of game development considerations. I'm going to start off with a little bit about myself and then move into some of these areas of exploration where I think that O3DE is especially well positioned to lead as an open source community project. This talk is meant to prime us as a community to think about some of the questions and ideas related to inclusive 3D development as we're building this engine and this community. Because building this inclusive engine foundation will allow content creators and a lot of other people who are adopting this engine to build inclusive game genres, simulation experiences, and metaverse applications. My name is Liv Erickson. Liv is short for Olivia, but I pretty much only use that name when I'm filling out legal paperwork or making a Starbucks order. I go by Miss Livy Rose online, despite the fact that most people don't call me Livy anymore. I identify as non-binary and use both she, her, and they, them pronouns, in part because of the social construct of gender assumptions and associations for women specifically when it comes to how they show up in the world, particularly in technology spaces, open source spaces, and gaming. I am also autistic. I was diagnosed at 27 years old, which means I've had just 3 years to figure out how I show up into communities and spaces, and that's why I'm giving the talk in this particular way. As much as I'd like to believe that my identity doesn't influence or impact the way that I create 3D content and do my own work and build technology, it does. But that's a talk for another time, or we can grab coffee or lunch just right after this. I've never built or shipped a AAA game, but I've spent all of my career working on open source metaverse technologies. Open 3D Engine is actually the third open source engine that I've worked on. The first was at a startup called High Fidelity, and the second was more recently at Mozilla. I tell you all of this because I want to level this playing field with how I show up in this community and introduce how my lived experiences and my identity bring me to this conference in a different way than others in the room. It's also a way that I've found to introduce the concept of intersectionality and inclusion to an audience. My experience and the context that I'm bringing here is a result of all of the factors of my identities that I've described to you, but also several that I haven't. I can't separate parts of myself from how I do my job. And speaking of my job, I should probably mention that I'm a senior product manager at AWS. I focus on editor and game systems for Open 3D Engine. Today I'm here to talk about inclusive 3D development, which encompasses a wide understanding of intersectionality and why we need to consider the aspects of the individual when understanding how they are impacted by or benefiting from systems, including technological ones. Inclusive 3D development encompasses a lot of different areas, and some of what I talk about today will be really specific and some will be really broad. What I'm not going to be giving you is a set of answers or formulas that we can use to just check off to ensure that we've created an inclusive community. Instead, what I hope I can do is get you thinking about the ways that inclusivity can show up in your work, regardless of what form that takes, across Open 3D Engine, since we're early on in the process and in the first few months and years of this project. When we talk about inclusion, there's a lot of things we can mean. I'm going to focus on what it means for a 3D engine, specifically ours, to be inclusive. There are 3 areas that I'll touch on with regards to this: algorithmic inclusion, content considerations, and community. With that introduction, let's dive in. So what does it mean for a 3D engine to be inclusive? The question assumes that technology can inherently be inclusive or exclusive, which some may consider still up for debate, but I'm not going to dive deep into that right now. Instead, I'd invite you to think about social media sites as an example and how they are restricted based on age, demographic, geography, the college you attend. All of those are forms of exclusivity. But a game engine? Can a game engine be inclusive? I believe it can, but it won't be automatically, even if it's open source, and that's why it's important to consider the ways that inclusivity can be built into the core foundation of Open 3D Engine across several dimensions. As engine developers, the design and implementation decisions that we make with O3DE have a downstream impact on the types of games and content that is produced with the engine. Let's take a look at what that means, starting with the example of creating digital agents that represent humans. Humans in the physical world, like all of us, at the end of the day are going to be the entities who are or are not impacted by inclusive behavior. And simulating humans is also a really common practice for games and simulations and most types of metaverse applications. Let's start with talking about how our understanding of rendering technology ultimately impacts the way that humans look in an experience and how Open3D Engine can make an impact in rendering diverse humans for inclusive development. Rendering, like very many systems in a game engine, is inherently mathematical at its core, but the techniques that we use to create models for rendering different objects and materials are based on assumptions. When we think about simulating something in 3D, we're often making decisions about the default thing that we're trying to simulate, whether that's an explicit decision or an implicit one. And our techniques for rendering are grounded in how accurately we're able to take an object and make it look the way we think it should, based on what it looks like in reality. And that means before we even get to the part where we're drawing something on a screen, or thinking about shaders and materials, we're mentally visualizing and thinking about what it is that we want to be able to draw. And a fundamental place where this comes into play for inclusivity is in how human skin is rendered. The rendering and lighting techniques that we use in computer graphics and computer simulations are based off of studying analog camera technologies, which largely classified light, low melanin human skin as the default human skin. And this default has made its way into a lot of graphics research papers and impacts the way that shadows and lighting models apply subsurface scattering to materials that light low melanin skin well, but drop the accurate specular highlights and reflection, which are the primary light transport models for dark skin. This is something that we can be thinking about at the engine level because we're already making some assumptions about how we're presenting skin to the end user of Open3D Engine. We've got two examples, light and dark. But skin tones aren't this straightforward. You can ask anybody who's thought about purchasing makeup online. This brand has 49 shades of different foundation to match skin tones, ranging from high and low melanin, light and dark skin, and being inclusive of whether or not the skin itself has warm or cool colored undertones. And Open3D Engine probably doesn't need to ship with 49 different examples of skin tones, but we can be doing more to think about how we're communicating to users about skin materials. I'd recommend that everybody watch Theodore Kim's talk on anti-racist graphics research from this year's SIGGRAPH conference, which I've included as a link at the end of the slides. Kim suggests that the industry as a whole start to take a stronger stance on identifying where racial bias has appeared in our algorithmic research, and suggests that there's a large opportunity to develop new, more inclusive algorithms that can better create photorealistic skin for a wide range of skin types. So if you haven't already seen it, take a look, and I think it's a really good place for us to be thinking as a community where we can drive some of that research forward. In a similar vein, physics engines and hair simulation algorithms have historically used hair types 1 and 2, which you can see here on this graph, as the default type of hair. And this makes simulating curly hair really challenging, and as a result of this, games and avatar creation systems may have to work around the restrictions of a system, either create these algorithms themselves or just simplify the hairstyles that they're creating. And as we think about how content creators will be building with O3DE, we can be really critical and intentional about expanding our own test cases to encompass a wider range of hair types, including type 3 and type 4 hair. To further illustrate this, I'd like to provide you with some additional resources and call specific attention to AMDark's open source Afro hair library, which is one project specifically highlighting the lack of diverse and accurate hairstyles in a lot of 3D asset libraries. Dark's open source Afro hair library was created to fund the creation of open source assets that more accurately represent Black hairstyles. And it was created after Dark searched popular 3D asset libraries and found that the majority of the results were stereotypical and racist representations of Black hair. Dark says about the project, which provides grant to Black 3D artists to do this work, struggles with diversity and inclusion are well documented within the tech industry, both in terms of who is represented in media products and who is producing that media. Despite a desire in many open source communities to make accessible software-based tools and resources, open source is even less diverse than the tech industry overall. I believe the open source Afro hair library can do some of the necessary cultural work to facilitate a more inclusive community. There's a really great podcast interview where Dark and Kim talk about the open source Afro hair library, again included in the resources, and I'd encourage everyone to take a listen to that, especially to better understand the journey and the unique challenges and experiences that content creators will have when building their own 3D experiences. And because we are an open source community, we have unique opportunities to collaborate on and share that work that's innovating in these spaces by inviting in these experts. But we have to keep in mind that it's on us and the currently active contributor community to be inviting those people in and including them in the work that we're doing. And we should look at the way that our engine is architected as being a unique strength that will enable us to better support content creators in this way. The GEM modular system and the focus on extensibility of the engine makes it relatively straightforward to experiment in these areas and to figure out how we can allow content creators to build content that's portable and representative of themselves. In the past, game mods have been one way that content creators are building their representation for their own selves and their own communities into games. And I think that this is a really interesting area of research that we can lean into with our engine. One example of this is the work that Xmiramira has been doing to extend The Sims. After finding a lack of options in The Sims that she felt represented her and her community, Xmiramira created a number of different expansion packs for the game that include skin tones, hairstyles, decor, and even the ability to rename the colleges and universities in The Sims to historically Black colleges and universities. This example is just one place where we can see that user-generated content creation can really drive additional audience growth and engagement because people want to see themselves and their stories in the games that they play. So as we consider these different methods of customization and an increased interest in having user-generated content become a core part of gameplay mechanics in titles today, we should be setting our sights on standards and how we can help drive some of that. There are numerous areas of research and industry leadership that's happening in organizations like the Kronos Group and the W3C, both of whom are looking at standard formats for 3D, spatial, and metaverse technologies. And by adopting and helping driving these standards forward, we have an opportunity to think about how we can help content creators take a larger role in the authoring part of the life cycle of a game. This is especially important for metaverse-style applications where the majority of the content for a platform is going to be created by players. And this leads us into another area where inclusive engine design can accelerate innovation in 3D application development, the editing experience. And there are a lot of different ways that we can scope editing and authoring tools, but I want to be cognizant of time, so I'm going to focus specifically on the accessibility of authoring 3D applications, because the line between authoring and experiencing 3D content is going to continue to blur as players take on an increasingly large part of that game's life cycle. I have an idealistic vision that Open3D Engine becomes the engine to go to regardless of whether or not you have a background in game development, because well, selfishly, that's my background and that's what I would like, but because it will open up a lot of possibilities for new content creators to come in and build really interesting and unique applications and experiencing. Making authoring tools not just approachable, though, but also accessible means a lot of different things. So to specifically define it for today, I'll speak to the idea that we can build interactions and systems for game and 3D asset creation that can be used by people with a range of disabilities. And while we often think about disability as being a permanent state, accessible design helps with short-term injury and situational adaptations as well, and it really benefits everyone. Consider how captioning video content allows deaf or hard of hearing users to access content, but also lets you experience something if you forgot your headphones or if you can't play volume because you're trying to keep it quiet while a baby is asleep. So game engines are a complex piece of software, but I see a lot of potential for how Open3D Engine can be built on and extended to work for this wide audience of users and be a foundation that enables research and development of solutions related to accessibility in the 3D space more generally. Because our responsibility is really in two parts. We have a responsibility to content creators who are using the engine that our tools are accessible to them. But I'd say we also have a responsibility to the content creators that they're able to make accessible games and experiences as well. So with that said, let's take a look at how we might think about different categories of accessibility as it relates to 3D content creation. The first category that we'll talk about is input and interactivity. For a game engine, you might make a default assumption about what kind of way a user is using it. For O3DE, maybe it's a user who has a keyboard and an external mouse and multiple monitors, but it may not be. It may be someone who has limited mobility who's using their voice to interact with their computer, or it could be someone who's using a specialized input controller. So something that we might want to think about in the future of our design for the editor and authoring tools for O3DE is how we might adopt our input system to encompass these different types of input systems. And if anyone's feeling especially interested in thinking about that and how to build an adaptive controller gem, I'd recommend checking out the talk on adding new input devices from yesterday's workshop. So there's considerations for navigation and input and interactivity around any type of editor tools that we have, but there's also unique considerations for navigation and content authoring inside of the viewport itself. And this is an area where there's a lot of potential for research and innovation. The W3C's Accessible Web Working Group and Immersive Technology Working Groups have been running workshops where they look at different ways that 3D scenes and environments themselves can be defined for visually impaired and blind users. Some techniques that have been presented include using machine learning and embedding conceptually aware captions and narrative descriptions directly inside of a 3D scene file format itself. I've included a link to the most recent workshop, which has a lot of different talks on a variety of topics that touch on inclusive 3D design at the end of this talk. And for a more general overview of game-specific accessibility, I would want to highlight the work that the Able Gamers charity is doing for both awareness of accessible gaming, but also in providing resources to developers and content creators who are actually building 3D experiences so that they can make decisions that their content is accessible to a wide range of users. They have an accessible player experience certification course that provides an overview of games accessibility in a 2-day workshop, and I would definitely recommend that folks check that out if they're thinking about different ways to make their content more accessible. And all of this is especially critical as we start to think about the next generation of computing devices with immersive technologies like virtual and augmented reality. Because adding head-mounted displays and spatially aware content into games and 3D experiences introduces an entirely new layer for 3D interactivity, and that needs to become accessible. If you're interested in learning more about accessibility and XR applications specifically, I'd recommend checking out the W3C's XR Accessibility User Requirements Guideline, which is a checklist of different actions that you can take to make sure that your experience is accessible, and also follow the work that a group called XR Access is doing. They tend to go through VR and XR experiences and highlight which ones are working on accessibility and how users with disabilities are able to navigate and interact with those spaces. So all this is a lot to cover, and it's impossible for any one person or team to become an expert in all of these areas, especially because a lot of it's new and developing. That's why it's critical that we're thinking about the community inclusion aspect of Open3D Engine as an intentional and fundamental pillar of our organization to do this work. I started off this talk with a little bit about myself because inclusivity means creating a space where those lived experiences that we have can be a part of the work that we do. Because diverse teams build better products, and we're able to reach a much wider audience of players and content creators if we make our content, our community and our engine inclusive. We start, though, by looking around and asking ourselves some questions, including things like who isn't being included right now in the conversations that we're having, and how do we bring them into this journey that we're going on together? We start by being willing to be vulnerable and open about our experiences and our backgrounds and how we can make design decisions based on those, even when it's challenging, uncomfortable, and vulnerable, which for the record, it very much was for me today. We start by talking about the things we aren't comfortable with yet because nobody has all the answers for this. So instead, I'm going to leave you with some questions. How can we support the work being done in anti-racist graphics and simulation research as a community? What are the ways that we can make O3DE an appealing engine for diverse content creators? How do we ensure that accessibility is embedded into our conversations about how we are building authoring tools for the engine? Who isn't represented in this conversation, and how do we bring them in? What groups could be harmed by the work that we're doing? And then to get a little bit meta, what can I do personally to practice inclusion to a greater degree in the work that I'm doing for O3DE? As promised throughout the talk, I've included links to the resources that I've mentioned today, but rather than this being the end of a single talk at the conference, I hope that this is the beginning of a discussion that we can continue to have as a community. I believe that Open3D Engine and the 3D industry as a whole will be better for it. Thank you.